inspired in his 3 children a lifelong passion for reading.
There are many ways to be removed from power inside a palace. The loudest way is the one everyone sees. The formal announcement, the stripped title, the public statement that leaves no room for interpretation. But the oldest way, the most effective way, the way that leaves no fingerprints and produces no formal record that can be challenged or appealed, is the invitation that simply never arrives. Camilla was expected at a key royal event, the kind of occasion where her being there as queen consort isn't optional, it's assumed. And then the invitation did not come. No explanation, no public acknowledgement, no official comment from anyone inside those walls, just absence, loud, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. The event, why this one matters.
And the United Kingdom has strained considerably under the Trump administration at a glamorous state.
Personally prioritized causes around violence and domestic abuse.
Not every royal event carries the same weight. The calendar is full with engagements, commemorations, state occasions, charity functions, and the rotating machinery of public appearances that keeps the monarchy running and relevant across the full expanse of British public life. Many of these events are significant in their own way. All of them matter to the people involved and the causes they represent. But some events are different. Some sit inside the royal calendar not just as public occasions, but as institutional markers. Moments that define who's who in the family in visible terms. That communicates, through the simple fact of who is present and who is not, something about the internal structure of the monarchy that no official statement ever quite captures. The event from which Camilla was reportedly excluded falls into this category. Sources familiar with the situation describe it as an occasion of genuine institutional significance, not a side engagement that could be missed without comment. Not the kind of function where an absence might be explained by a scheduling conflict and accepted without question by the people paying attention. This event involves the formal representation of the crown at a level that makes the queen consort's participation not just appropriate, but expected. Expected in the way that certain things inside the monarchy are expected. Not because anyone has stated it explicitly, because the precedent and the protocol and the entire accumulated understanding of what her role means says that she should be there. She was not there. And in the world of royal communications, where absence is as carefully managed and as deliberately communicated as presence, that was not nothing. To understand why this particular exclusion carries the weight it does, you have to understand what Camilla's consistent presence at events like this has historically represented. It has been one of the primary visible signs of her full integration into the working monarchy. The evidence, renewed at every such occasion, that the rehabilitation is complete. That the journey from the most unpopular woman in Britain to queen consort has arrived somewhere stable and secure and no longer needs the constant careful management it required in the early days. Every time Camilla appears at an event of this institutional significance, it says something. It says she belongs here, that her position is real and functioning and recognized in the most practical sense by the people who run the institution around her. Her absence from this event says the opposite, not loudly, not in any way that produces an official version that can be pointed to and debated, but clearly enough that the people inside those walls who understand how these things work got the message without needing it spelled out. Something has changed. And the change is now visible in the most concrete way this institution allows. The question that started circulating among those paying close attention was not whether the absence was significant. That was obvious. The question was whether it was a decision or a consequence. Whether someone with the authority to shape the event's attendance had deliberately chosen to exclude Camilla. Or whether the dispute that sources describe as the backdrop to all of this had created a situation so hostile that her own withdrawal was really what happened. The distinction matters because a deliberate exclusion by someone with institutional authority represents a different and more serious development than a situation where Camilla was technically free to attend, but found the environment too difficult to make attendance workable. Both versions are significant, but they are significant in different ways. And they point toward different conclusions about who exactly has the power inside this palace to make a queen consort's presence at a key royal event something other than guaranteed. Sources familiar with the inner palace suggest the truth sits closer to the deliberate end of that spectrum than the withdrawal end, which means someone made a call. Someone decided, in the context of a dispute that sources describe as serious enough to produce this outcome, that Camilla's presence at this specific occasion was not something they were prepared to facilitate, and that someone had enough standing inside the institution to make that decision stick. Who that someone is changes everything about what this story means. The dispute. What happened behind closed doors? Every exclusion has a trigger, and the trigger here did not arrive without warning. It did not come from a single bad day or an isolated moment of friction between people who otherwise get along fine. It came from somewhere deeper than that, from a dispute that sources describe as having been built inside the palace with a pressure that the usual ways of managing royal conflict were no longer able to contain. The nature of the dispute goes beyond the personal tensions that have been documented in previous months. This is not the Anne confrontation revisited. It is not a continuation of the conversation around Camilla's failed palace plan or the demand that William refused. Those events are part of the same story, but they are not this. This is something that develops separately in a different part of the palace's operations, around a specific set of decisions that Camilla apparently influenced or attempted to influence in ways that produced a reaction from people who had both the authority and the will to push back in ways she did not see coming. Specifically, the direction of certain arrangements connected to the formal functioning of the monarchy during a period where the question of transition and continuity is more pressing than at any point in recent history. Camilla apparently took a position on these arrangements, a position she communicated with enough force and enough expectation of compliance that it didn't read as input. It read as an attempt to steer an outcome in a room that the people responsible for that outcome did not consider hers to steer. That distinction between offering a perspective and trying to determine the outcome is one that the palace navigates carefully in normal circumstances. In the current circumstances, with the balance of power shifting as visibly as it has been, the tolerance for blurring that line has narrowed considerably. The specific response to Camilla's position was not immediate. Sources describe a period in which the dispute existed in the particular palace limbo of things that are known and felt, but not yet formally addressed, where the people on the receiving end of Camilla's attempted direction were deciding how to respond, considering whether to address it directly versus allowing it to surface in the outcome of the specific arrangements being contested. They allowed it to surface in the outcome, and the outcome included the exclusion. Now, the question of who else was involved in this dispute beyond Camilla and the immediate parties to the specific arrangements being contested is the detail that makes it more significant than a straightforward operational disagreement. Because the dispute did not stay contained to its original participants. It traveled in the way that disputes inside the palace travel when they touch on matters of genuine institutional sensitivity, through the informal networks that connect the different households and the different power centers within the monarchy, to people whose awareness of it changed the atmosphere around Camilla in ways that preceded the exclusion and contributed to the conditions that made it possible. William's household became aware of the dispute. Sources are careful about specifying the precise channel through which that awareness developed, but the awareness itself is not in question. The Wales circle knew what had occurred, knew what Camilla had attempted, and the response from that circle in terms of what support or protection it extended to Camilla in the aftermath was the same pointed non-intervention that has characterized the Wales household's response to previous moments of Camilla overreach. Silence, deliberate, legible to anyone paying attention. Catherine's awareness of the dispute and her position on it has been described by sources as consistent with everything we know about where she currently stands there in relation to Camilla. Not driving the response, not the visible agent of whatever consequences followed, but informed, and not inclined to use the influence she has accumulated to avoid those consequences. The combination of Camilla having pushed too hard in a space she did not have the authority to direct, the Wales household declining to provide the cover that might have limited the damage, and the people directly involved in the dispute deciding to let the outcome speak for itself, produced the exclusion. It was not a clean single decision made by one person in one moment. It was several people and several responses to what Camilla did, all arriving at the same result from different directions at the same time. That convergence is what makes it so significant, and so difficult for Camilla to challenge through any available channel. You can appeal a decision made by one person. You can negotiate with a single opposing position. You can find the pressure point in a two-sided dispute and work it until something shifts. You cannot do any of those things when the outcome was produced by a group that has no single author and no single point of appeal. Camilla is experienced enough to understand that, which is why, in the days following the exclusion, her response has been something other than the pushback her previous form might have suggested. It has been silence. And in this palace, right now, Camilla's silence is the loudest thing in the room. The decision, who made the call, and how
all of the mood music coming from the palace on this and from the British Embassy is
decisions made inside palaces are rarely what they appear to be on the surface. They look singular. They look like a moment when someone in authority made a choice, and that choice produced an outcome. Clean, traceable, and attributable to a specific person exercising a specific power for a specific purpose. The reality is almost always more spread out than that. It is more of the result of several people arriving at the same position than of one person making one decisive call. The palace does not operate through the kind of direct, documented decision-making you would recognize in a normal organization. It operates through the accumulated weight of relationships and understandings and the particular way that outcomes emerge when enough of the people with influence over a situation are all pointing in the same direction. The decision to exclude Camilla from the key royal event was of this type, and understanding how it was made requires understanding the specific structure of authority over the event in question. The event's organization involved multiple parties within the palace, some with formal authority over its planning and execution, some with informal influence over its character and its attendance. The intersection of those formal and informal layers is where the decision that produced Camilla's exclusion was made. Not in a single conversation, not through a formal process with documented minutes. In the particular way that outcomes are shaped inside institutions that run on understanding rather than instruction. The person or persons with formal authority over the event's attendance made choices consistent with their formal role. Nothing that could be pointed to as an explicit exclusion of the queen consort. Nothing that formally announced itself as a decision to keep her away. Simply the practical management of the occasion in ways that did not create a space for her participation and did not generate the communication that would have been required to include her. The invitation that never came was not the result of an oversight. It was the result of an absence of the specific action required to produce it. And that absence was deliberate, chosen, by people who understood exactly what they were choosing and what its absence would communicate. Who specifically made that choice has been described by sources in terms that are careful about attribution, but clear about the level of institutional standing involved. This was not a junior aide making an unauthorized decision. This was not the result of poor communication between different households. The level of the people involved and the significance of the event make both of those explanations impossible to sustain. The decision was made at a level that knew exactly what it was deciding. And here's the part that changes its meaning most significantly. The decision required, at minimum, the tolerance of William's household to produce and sustain the outcome it produced, because an exclusion of the Queen Consort from a key royal event that the Prince of Wales was actively opposed to would not have survived intact through the period between the decision and the event itself. William has enough institutional authority and enough practical influence over the arrangements around royal occasions to have intervened if he had chosen to. He did not intervene. Sources describe his household's relationship to the decision as one of informed non-interference, awareness of what was happening, understanding of why it was happening, and a deliberate choice not to step in a way that would have prevented the outcome. That non-interference is itself a decision. In palace terms, one of the most significant kinds, because it communicates without requiring a formal statement or an explicit position where William stands on the legitimacy of what occurred. He did not block the exclusion. He let it happen. And Camilla, when she understood the full picture of how the invitation had failed to arrive, would have understood what that meant. Not just that she had been excluded from an event, but that the person whose intervention could have prevented it had chosen not to provide it. That is a different and more devastating message than the exclusion itself. The manner in which Camilla was informed, or more precisely, not informed of her exclusion, has been described as consistent with the broader approach to the situation. No formal communication acknowledging the exclusion as a deliberate act. No official explanation that would have required an official response. The simple non-arrival of the expected invitation, followed by the absence of any palace communication filling the gap that absence created, leaving Camilla in the position of someone who understands perfectly well what has happened and has no formal mechanism through which to address it, because addressing it formally would require acknowledging it. And acknowledging it would mean confirming on the record that the Queen Consort was excluded from a key royal event following a palace dispute. That is a story the palace will not confirm. For the same reason, it will not deny it, because the ambiguity serves the purpose of the people who produced the outcome. It creates a consequence without creating a confrontation. It communicates without committing. It tells Camilla exactly what she needs to know while giving her nothing she can formally push back against. It is, in the most precise sense, a palace move, elegant, devastating, and completely deniable. Charles King, watching his family fracture.
Parker, Anna Wintour, and our very own resident bookworm, Jenna. They
Greatest libraries, and somewhere I've always wanted to visit.
There is a particular kind of pain that belongs to people who love deeply on both sides of a divide, not the clean pain of being wronged, not the manageable pain of a conflict where the right side is obvious and the way through it is clear. The complicated, unrelenting pain of watching two people you cannot live without pulling in opposite directions, and knowing that you standing between them isn't stopping it, and you stepping away isn't fixing it either. Charles knows this pain. He has known versions of it before, but what he is living with right now, in the specific situation of his wife being excluded from a key royal event and his son's household declining to prevent it, is a version that his previous experience has not fully prepared him for. Because previous versions always had a resolution available, a conversation that could be had, a relationship that could be managed toward a better position, a difficult period that the shared interest in the institution's survival would eventually pull everyone through towards something more functional. This version is different, and Charles, who is more institutionally intelligent than he has ever been given full credit for, understands why it is different. It is different because the person driving the direction is not someone of equivalent standing to him or Camilla. It is his heir, the future king. A man whose position within the monarchy is not just formally significant, but practically unchallengeable in the long run in a way that nobody else inside those walls can claim. You can manage a dispute between equals. You can apply the weight of your authority to bring two people of equivalent standing to a position that works for the institution even when it does not fully satisfy either of them. You cannot do that when one of the people in the dispute is the person who will run the institution after you, whose eventual authority over everything within those walls exceeds your own not now, but in a future that everyone inside those walls is already preparing for. To formally side with Camilla against William in a dispute of this nature would require Charles to use whatever authority he has remaining to protect his wife's position at the direct expense of his son's clearly stated direction for the monarchy's future. In a period when his health makes the question of that future more immediately pressing than anyone would have chosen. The cost of that intervention in terms of the relationship with William and the institutional damage of a visible rift between the current king and his heir is a cost that Charles is not in a position to pay. Not now. Not in these circumstances. Not with everything that his health situation has changed about what he can sustain and what he must conserve. So he is watching and not intervening. And living with everything that not intervening means for the woman he has loved through circumstances that would have ended most relationships and most careers and most public rehabilitation projects long before they reached anything resembling success. Sources close to the king describe his private state in this period with a consistency that is itself significant. The word that recurs most frequently is not angry, not frustrated, not even sad in the acute sense of fresh grief. It is tired. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been managing the impossible for so long that he simply doesn't have enough left to keep doing it, who looks at the fractures spreading through his family and his institution and understands both its causes and its trajectory, and finds himself without the resources to do what his instinct tells him should be done. He wants to protect Camilla. That instinct is as deep and as genuine as anything in his emotional life. She has been the person who stayed who absorbed the public hostility and the institutional resistance and the years of rehabilitation work and remained beside him through all of it with a constancy that he has never taken for granted. To watch her be excluded from a key royal event, to know that his son's household permitted that exclusion, to be unable to formally address it without making everything worse in ways the institution cannot afford. That is not a position that resolves into anything clean. It sits, it accumulates. It adds to the weight of everything else Charles is carrying in a period that was already requiring more of him than his health readily permits. People close to him describe moments of visible strain that go beyond the physical. The look of someone carrying something too heavy with nobody to hand it to, who loves his wife and loves his son, and is watching those two loves create a pressure between them that his presence in the middle is no longer able to equalize. He has not spoken to either of them about the exclusion in terms that address it directly. Sources suggest conversations have occurred around the edges of it, carefully, without landing in the specific territory that would require formal positions to be taken and formal consequences to follow from those positions. He is managing the way he always manages, through the careful maintenance of surfaces that the institution requires to function regardless of what is happening beneath them. But the surface is thinner than it has ever been, and the man holding it in place is more tired than anyone outside those walls is being allowed to see. The wider pattern, a monarchy reorganizing around its future.
And a sign of the covenant sworn this day.
Thousands of book donations. The Queen says that the joy of reading.
Let's take a step back from the immediate story for a moment. Step back from the exclusion and the dispute in Charles' impossible position, and look at what you can see when you take in the full picture of the past several months inside the British palace. Because what is visible from that distance is not a series of isolated incidents, not a collection of unrelated family tensions that happen to be occurring in the same compressed time frame. What is visible is a pattern, deliberate, and pointing with increasing clarity toward a conclusion about what is happening inside the monarchy that the official version has not yet been willing to state. The monarchy is reorganizing around its future, at a pace and with an intentionality that the previous management of the Sussex situation and the Camilla rehabilitation and all the other palace dynamics of recent years did not prepare the outside world to expect. Consider the sequence. The private meeting where Princess Anne confronted Camilla directly and William backed every word of it. That was the first visible crack on the surface. The moment when the private reservations that had been carefully managed for years were allowed to express themselves in a room of witnesses in a way that could not be walked back to the previous position. Then Catherine's deliberate protocol breach. The woman who never puts a foot wrong, choosing to put one wrong with surgical precision in a public setting. A message delivered in the language the institution itself invented to the people inside the institution who were fluent enough to receive it. Then William's direct refusal of Camilla's formal demand. The first explicit, unambiguous no from the future king to the current queen consort on a matter of institutional authority and its appropriate limits. Then Anne shutting down Camilla's palace plan before it could build the momentum it needed to become viable. Moving with the speed and the completeness of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at and had both the standing and the backing to dismantle it before it took root. And now this, the exclusion from a key royal event following a palace dispute, the invitation that never came, the intervention that William's household declined to provide. 5 distinct moments, 5 different forms, but a single direction. Every one of these events has moved the same way, has communicated the same thing, has drawn the same line between the position Camilla currently holds and the position she has been reaching toward with the informal influence and the boundary testing that sources have been documenting for months. That consistency is not accidental. Patterns this clear inside institutions of this discipline do not come from independent actors coincidentally arriving at the same decision. They come from a shared understanding of what is being built and what needs to be limited for that building to proceed on the terms the builders intend. The builders in this case are William and Catherine, with Anne as the most powerful and most active ally in the adjacent generation, operating from a shared understanding of what the monarchy needs to be in its next chapter and what it needs to no longer be. What it needs to no longer be is an institution whose informal power structures are shaped by accommodating Charles's personal choices in ways that carry forward into a reign that has its own logic and its own boundaries, and its own clear sense of who has genuine authority within it. Camilla is the primary figure through whom that accommodation has operated, not the only one, but the most significant. And the reorganization that is underway is, in its most practical dimension, a reorganization around the question of what role she plays in the institution that William is inheriting and reshaping simultaneously. The answer being communicated through the pattern of the past months is becoming difficult to misread. A formal role with formal limits, honored in the specific and bounded way that the institution's protocols require, but not the extended, informal, boundary-pushing influence that has characterized her operation within the current reign. Not in William's monarchy. The pace of the reorganization is the detail that perhaps deserves the most attention, because it is faster than most people outside those walls would have expected. The conventional assumption about how these transitions work is that the outgoing configuration is maintained intact until the formal transition of power and the incoming generation shapes the institution after the throne has passed. What appears to be happening is different. The shaping is occurring now, and the decisions being made and the outcomes being produced and the limits being drawn while Charles is still king, by people who have apparently decided that waiting for the formal transition creates risks they are not willing to accept. The exclusion of Camilla from this event is not just a consequence of a specific dispute. It is a data point in a larger project. A project of institutional redefinition that is happening faster and more deliberately than the official version of events would suggest. And Camilla, who understands this institution as well as almost anyone alive, knows exactly what she is looking at. The question is what she can do about it. What comes next? Camilla's options in a palace that is changing around her.
Local newspaper, bingo. You know, all these.
Probably there was nothing he could do about it.
The then Prince Charles.
There is a moment in every difficult situation where the options available to you become clear. Not comfortable, not appealing, but clear. Camilla has reached that moment, and the options visible to her from where she currently stands are considerably fewer and considerably less powerful than anything she would have anticipated when she began the sequence of moves that led to this point. Let's be precise about her actual position. Right now, she holds the title of Queen Consort. That title is not under formal threat from anyone. Nobody inside the palace is pursuing a process that would strip it from her. The constitutional arrangements that govern her role are intact. The formal courtesies continue to be observed. In public, she appears at the engagements her schedule requires and is received with the appropriate deference and the appropriate ceremony. But a formal title and the day-to-day operational reality are two different things. And the operational reality of Camilla's position inside the palace has changed in ways that the title alone cannot protect against. The first option available to her is escalation, taking the exclusion and the dispute and the accumulated pattern of what has been happening directly to Charles, formally, explicitly, asking him to use whatever authority he has remaining to address what is being done to her position. Inside the institution, he still technically leads. The problem with this option is the same problem it has always been in this format. Charles is caught using his authority on Camilla's behalf in a direct confrontation with William's direction for the institution. It does not just damage his relationship with his heir. It creates a visible, public fracture between the current king and the future one at exactly the moment when the monarchy's stability depends most on that relationship appearing functional and cooperative. Charles cannot afford to produce that fracture. His health makes the question of institutional continuity too urgent and too fragile to risk on an intervention that, even if it succeeded in the short term, would cost more than it returned. Camilla knows this. She has lived inside this institution long enough to understand the calculations Charles has to make. Escalating to him formally means asking him to pay a price she already suspects he is not in a position to pay. And confirming that suspicion in a direct conversation would leave her in a worse position than the current one, because at least now the question of Charles's capacity to protect her remains open. Formally asking and being told no closes it. The second option is the legal and constitutional route, engaging advisors to examine whether the exclusion from the event represents a breach of any formal understanding of her role's requirements. exploring whether the process by which the invitation failed to arrive was procedurally appropriate given the protocols that govern the Queen Consort's participation in events of this type. This path has the advantage of formality, of creating a documented record of the dispute and the exclusion that exists in a space where the palace's preference for ambiguity cannot operate as effectively as it does in the informal realm. But it has a devastating disadvantage. Pursuing it formally means making the exclusion official, means confirming publicly through the process of challenging it that the Queen Consort was blocked from a key royal event following a palace dispute. The story that the palace's silence has kept at the level of informed speculation becomes, through a formal legal or constitutional process, a documented fact with an official paper trail. That is not a story Camilla can afford to confirm any more than the palace can. Her position's remaining credibility rests partly on the ambiguity, on the public not having official confirmation of the full extent of what has been happening to her standing inside those walls. The third option is the one consistent with how Camilla has always operated at her most effective: patience and strategic retreat, accepting the current limitations without formally acknowledging them, pulling back from the overreach that has been triggering these responses, focusing on what she still has rather than continuing to push toward what has been denied. This is the path of someone who understands that the current situation is not the final one, that Charles is still king, that the formal transition of power has not occurred, that the space between now and that transition contains possibilities that the current confrontational dynamic is making it impossible to explore. Pulling back, waiting, preserving the relationships and the access that still exist rather than sacrificing them in a fight she is currently not winning. Sources describe the atmosphere inside Camilla's household in the wake of the exclusion as one of deliberate recalibration, of conversations about positioning, about what the next months need to look like to stop the deterioration of her standing without escalating the confrontations that have been producing it. Whether that recalibration is sufficient to meaningfully change her trajectory is the question that nobody close to the situation can answer with confidence. Because the people reorganizing the palace around its future are not waiting for her to recalibrate. They are already building the next chapter. And the space they are building it in is getting smaller every time Camilla looks up from her own calculations to measure how much room is left. The uninvited queen,
just living in a world where my father was.
Camilla fought for 50 years to stand inside this institution, through public hostility, through the protests, through the years of rehabilitation that required more patience and more persistence than most people possess. Through everything the British public and the British press threw at her on the long road, from the woman they blamed to the woman they accepted, she earned that crown in the only way available to her, through time and endurance and the refusal to be removed by forces that tried very hard to remove her. And now the forces working against her are not outside the palace gates. They are inside them. The invitation that never came was not an oversight. It was a verdict. This story is far from over.